In 2006, Viswanathan Anand defeated Sergey Karjakin in what was at the time considered his immortal game. He has since surpassed this game, but that in no way diminishes the magnificence of this victory, which is unquestionably one of the great chess games of all time. This game begins with a Sicilian defense. Although it's a highly theoretical battle, we're not going to get deep into the theory, and instead we'll focus on the instructive thrust and counter-thrust of ideas in the game. Karjakin picks the English attack with bishop e3, which intends a pawn storm and has become very popular ever since the 1980s. It's one of the sharpest and most aggressive options available to white against the Sicilian defense, and specifically against the Najdorf that Anand now plays with pawn to e5. After a lot of additional natural moves, we see this fascinating struggle develop where both players are sending their pawns straight up the board, thrust, thrust, thrust with the G and the B pawns. So you probably are familiar with the idea that in opposite sides castling positions, you want to use a pawn storm to expose the opponent's king. Ordinarily, when you castle on the same side as your opponent, you have to be careful about pushing your pawns because you expose your own king. That's not the case when you castle on opposite sides, and the Sicilian defense, and in particular the English attack, are the best openings to demonstrate this idea of the importance of surging forward with your pawns and using them to attack. So after this aggressive development from both players, you can see some fireworks and exchanges early in the game that does not reduce the sharpness of the position, but in this case, both players choose to retreat their knights. Now, the pawns continue forward, f4, a5, f5, and a4 here, both players surging forward with those pawns and trying to attack. It is possible for white to capture now on e6, and black can capture on b3, which is also very, very interesting. For example, in this position, after the capture with check on f7, white would now play the move king b1, leaving the pawn on a3, so that the pawn could, if black captured here, stand in the way of the rook. This is called an umbrella pawn and would actually get in the way of black's attack because the king feels oddly safe here on a1, and black did not really manage to open lines for his rook to enter the attack. Instead, after the pawn advance a4, the knight hops into d4. Really cool little idea here. And the point is that this bishop is stuck because after the capture on d4, which does happen in the game, when the knight captures, the bishop cannot take on a2 because of knight c6, which is strong when the queen moves, and the e7 bishop falls. This is a good line for white, although it's still really, really sharp. So after knight takes d4, the bishop is trapped. Notice that the knight's recapture also opened up the bishop to cover c4 here. So a very cool little idea. Black accepts that the bishop is lost and surges forward with the pawns again to open more lines. Now, we can't allow the pawn to take here and make a queen, so king b1 is played. The pawn captures on c2, and the knight captures. This is another good moment to pause a little bit and think about what black should play here. You could definitely pause your video and try and figure out the best move for black in this position. So we know that the bishop on e6 is trapped. We're going to have to give it back. That's unavoidable, but let's give it back in the best way possible. Bishop b3, right? Now, when white takes the bishop, which white does, white can't accept being down a piece, the A file opens. So this suddenly gives black a tremendous amount of attacking potential. Of course, this has been seen before. This is high-level preparation from both players, so they've both anticipated this contest so far. The knight hops to a3, which does sideline it, but it also shuts down the a-file. Black's knight hops to e5, h4 happens, and now a nice move, rook a5. The idea behind rook a5 is to play the queen to a8 and to amp up the pressure here on the a-file, also to use the queen to attack the e4 pawn, and hopefully to open the possibility of developing the rook later. All of black's pieces are starting to get into the action. And although this is a very complex position, I think what one should start to sense over the next several moves is that black's pieces are getting into the attack. Both players have sent their pawns up the board in classic opposite sides castling fashion, but the role of the pawns is to open lines so that the pieces can enter the attack. Black is already in that phase of the attack, and white is not. The pawns have not yet managed to open lines for the white pieces, so although this is very, very complicated, there's a lot to be said still about this game, there's much to analyze, I think we should start to sense over the next few moves that black is ahead because black's pieces are starting to participate and whites are not. So queen to c3 is played. This might even be the losing move, although that's quite a strong statement. It's hard to pin down the losing move because Stockfish does not immediately appreciate how strong black's attack is. The queen goes to a8, and the move bishop g2 is played to connect the rooks and to defend the pawn on e4. Now, this is a fantastic moment to pause the video and really think. I would encourage you, if you really want to improve, think for 20, 30 minutes, even an hour on this position, and try and decide what you would play right here. So I want to start here with a false path. The natural move in this position, to my mind, is to play d5. This opens the bishop, allowing a capture on a3, and it is very thematic in Sicilians like this to try to play d5. It's often even said if you get d5 in the Sicilian, you're going to take the initiative as black. So this move should catch our eye. However, it does not work. The knight on e5 is hanging, but our analysis shouldn't stop there because after we take on a3, we are opening the a file. There's the sting in the tail here that gives white a winning position. Without this move, black would have good compensation at this point, and the game would be, let's say, unclear. Bishop c5 hits the rook on f8 and the rook on a3 and does refute black's attack here. So we have to abandon this d5 idea, and going back to the position after bishop g2, it looks like black is stuck, especially if we can't play d5. The knight on e8, rook on f8, and bishop on e7 are unable to participate in the attack. If that's true, what I said earlier about these pieces entering the attack isn't really viable. Black does not have enough pieces to finish white off, and if he can't introduce more, he's just going to lose. So in Anand's own description of the position, he says here, well, I only had one move. I don't think I analyzed it very much because if it doesn't work, nothing works. That is the move knight to c7. This is not just a single piece sacrifice, it's a double piece sacrifice. It is a 2 exclamation mark move. It is an absolutely brilliant move. And the idea is that, of course, you're freeing the rook on f8 to participate in the attack, and after queen takes c7, the rook hops to c8, another piece is sacrificed. This is anticipated by Anand. Queen takes e7, but now our heavy pieces are breathing fire down on the white position. At this point, we need one more piece to get involved in the attack, and white is overwhelmed. Knight to c4. It's interesting that at this point still the Stockfish I have in my browser says that white is doing okay, and that's simply not true. At this point, black is winning. The knight hops into c4, and of course you can't capture this because rook a1 is an immediate mate. So the a file will inevitably be opened at this point in the game. Karjakin does seek counterplay on the opposite wing with g6. It's still very difficult to play precisely and bring home the victory as black. The correct move that Anand does play is h takes g6, which gives the king some room to run over here. You can't allow the pawn to capture on f7 when there are back rank issues, but by capturing with the h-pawn, we open up some fleeing room for our king. F takes g6. Now it's time to take on a3, now that our king has room to run. Pawn takes, and rook takes on a3. White does capture on f7, and the king runs, as we discussed a moment ago. I want to pause for a moment and give the move bishop d4 covering a1. which would win for white if only it worked. If it's your move here, what would you play? Well, of course, Anand is ready here. Rook a1, which is a clearance sacrifice, forces the capture of the rook and allows the queen to come into a2 with checkmate. If you've never seen this mating pattern before, it's a good one. When you have a rook and a queen in a line like this, it's not uncommon to sacrifice the rook to allow the queen to enter a square short. So going back after king h7, white tries to distract black successfully with an under promotion, f8 equals knight. Black captures that, which does take the rook away from the c file, but it's not enough to save the day for white at this point in the game. Queen takes f8, and now we get a little finesse from black. We can capture the queen, but it's better to first go ahead and throw in rook a2 check. I'm sorry, rook a1 check, king b2, and then rook a2 check. And now the king has some options. If he takes on b3, there's a mating pattern that you really should put in your memory box if you haven't already. Queen check, king here, rook check, king over, queen check. A bit of a ladder mate whenever you have the queen and rook in a position like this where they're 2 squares apart, boom, 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 is usually checkmate. If the king runs back to b1 instead, then black does go and capture the queen, but we've improved by getting our rook to a2 with check, and so this is even stronger than before. We're already hitting a loose piece, and the king is thoroughly exposed. We are going to be able to finish this one off pretty quickly. So after rook a2, the king tries to go to c3, and we're not even going to capture this queen. Again, that should be enough to win because white's pieces are disjointed and his king is still exposed. But we have better at this point. Queen a5 check. We're forcing checkmate with our heavy pieces. The king tries to go to d3. Again, whenever we take here, we're always running into the same mate. Queen b5 check. King up to d4, and now the, I think, critical moment, the critical move to force this checkmate is rook to a4. The rook has to take a step back to finish off the coordination. The king is forced back to c3, and then simply queen c4 check. At this point in the game, Karjakin resigned, but the checkmate is obviously right there. The king can run here or here. In both cases, the response is the same. The rook is going to enter on a2, and whether the king has managed to flee here or if it got back here, we would have a queen mate on c2 or e2. I'll just show this particular one. I hope that you've enjoyed this game as much as I have. It's one of Anand's great games. It's one of the greatest Sicilian defenses of all time. If you want to check out more of Anand's games, please do click the playlist here where we have analyzed lots and lots of Anand's games, and please do subscribe so you'll be notified of new videos. Thank you so much and have a fantastic day.